Hey guys! Tonight we begin in the dusty valleys and sun-scorched hills of a land that will, much later, be called Iran. But back when our story begins, it isn't an empire. It's a scattered patchwork of tribes and goat herders, hill fortresses and barley fields. You can almost feel the dry wind catching your sleeve and taste the grit in your teeth as you follow a boy who tends sheep just outside the ancient region of Anshan. That boy's name? Cyrus. No crown, no palace, just calloused hands, tired eyes, and an inconvenient destiny quietly taking root under the stars. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trail behind this future king as he climbs a ridge at sunrise. The sheep don't care that one day he'll rule the largest empire the world has ever seen. For now, he's just another teenager dodging snakes and wondering when his dad will stop yelling about responsibility. But stories about this boy drift down the mountains. He's brave. He listens more than he talks. And the elders, those wrinkled old men who swear they've seen everything, say there's something different about his eyes, something watchful, like he's already peering beyond the horizon, toward cities he hasn't conquered yet. Cyrus's people are Persians, part of the broader Medo-Persian world that sat in the shadow of larger kingdoms like Elam and Babylon. But around 559 BCE, this quiet shepherd gets a promotion, King of Anshan. It's a minor title, really, like being the mayor of a small, dusty province with more sheep than people. Yet he wears the crown lightly and carries his sword rarely. That, of course, won't last. According to one slightly dramatic tale, the kind Herodotus loved, Cyrus's birth had been prophesied to overthrow his grandfather's empire. Naturally, said grandfather, King Astyages of the Medes, wasn't thrilled, so he ordered baby Cyrus killed. You know, standard grandfatherly affection, but the guards tasked with murder chickened out and gave the infant to a shepherd instead. That shepherd's wife, unable to have children of her own, raised Cyrus as her own. It's like Moses in the reeds, but with goats and much worse dental care. Now, historians still argue whether that origin story is pure folklore or cleverly planted propaganda. But even skeptics admit Cyrus had a strange knack for making others follow him. By the time he challenged his grandfather for real, his charisma had already done half the conquering. Troops switched sides, nobles whispered in corners, and before long, Cyrus marched into the Median capital with barely a sword drawn. The old man's empire? Absorbed. The old king? Deposed. Family dinners after that were, one assumes, awkward. What set Cyrus apart wasn't just conquest. It was how he conquered. When he eventually took Babylon in 539 BCE, it wasn't with fire and blood. The city gates were opened, perhaps even welcomed him. There are cuneiform tablets, the Cyrus cylinder, to be precise, that boast of how he restored temples, freed captives, and honored local gods. If PR firms existed in the Iron Age, this guy would have hired the best of them. But what makes Cyrus truly echo in the corridors of biblical history is a single, bold move. He let the Jews go home. Imagine being a Hebrew exile in Babylon, your city razed, your temple gone, your people scattered. And then this Persian king, a foreigner, declares that the God of heaven has told him to rebuild the Jerusalem temple. That's not just an administrative act, it's a thunderclap in the silence. Suddenly, you're packing bags, gathering scrolls, and whispering blessings through tears. This isn't just policy, it's prophecy come alive. The book of Isaiah even calls Cyrus his anointed one, a title normally reserved for Israel's own kings or priests. The original Hebrew word is Mashiach, yes, the same root as Messiah. And here it's being applied to a Gentile king in a pointy hat who prays to Ahura Mazda and eats dates off golden plates. That must have sent theological eyebrows sky high in synagogues for centuries. But there's more to it than religious diplomacy. By endorsing the return to Jerusalem, Cyrus wasn't just being benevolent, he was stabilizing his western frontier, earning loyalty from border populations, and reasserting control through permission rather than oppression. Clever, isn't it? Rule through gratitude, not fear. It's almost charming until you realize how well it worked. Even Jewish writings outside the Bible remember Cyrus with odd warmth. One rabbinic tradition paints him as a kind of Noahic ruler, a righteous Gentile who honored God despite being outside the covenant. That's a big deal in a culture usually very particular about who counts as in. Of course, not everything was robes and roses. Some exiles refused to return, preferring the comforts of Babylonian life to the long hike back to a ruined Jerusalem. And not all Persian officials were thrilled about the Reformation party happening in Judea. But for now, Cyrus's name shimmered like a beacon on the horizon. Shepherd, king, chosen instrument, and in the quiet rooms of Babylonian homes, exiled fathers whispered to their sons about a strange, foreign king who didn't speak their tongue, but somehow heard their cries. The story spread, folded into prayers, etched into memory. It's still there, in dusty scrolls, cracked stone, and somewhere in the soft hum of history, waiting for you to notice. You wake the next morning to the low groan of ox carts in the distance. The Babylonian sun is already creeping through the slats of your window, painting long lines across the packed earth floor. You stretch, rubbing the sleep from your shoulders, and try to remember if it's been 4 years or 5 since you arrived here. Or was it 10? Time slips like sand through your fingers when you're not exactly a citizen, not exactly a prisoner, just an exile waiting for someone to tell you what comes next. Then, as if on cue, someone does. A scribe rushes into the narrow alley behind the synagogue, scroll in hand, words tumbling out of his mouth before his breath catches up. "He's done it," he gasps. "Cyrus has declared we can go home." For a moment, no one moves, just birds chattering, and the hot wind tugging at the edge of the announcement. Then someone laughs, disbelieving, then another, and then you're running, following the murmurs of home, Jerusalem, rebuilt, through the crowded streets like a child chasing the end of a rainbow. The decree of Cyrus spreads faster than any royal edict has a right to. It says, depending on which scroll you're reading, that the God of heaven, not Marduk or Ishtar, has charged Cyrus with rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, that the exiles may return, that gold and silver vessels stolen during the original sack of the temple are to be returned, that they won't even have to sneak out in the night. This is not a jailbreak, it's a royal invitation. Of course, not everyone rejoices. Some families have built successful lives in exile. They've got homes, businesses, Babylonian friends, a surprisingly good falafel place just down the canal. Others wonder whether this is a trap, or some imperial ploy, or just another reason to hope and be disappointed. But the old ones, the ones who remember the temple's smell, the sound of Levites singing in the courtyards, begin packing immediately. They've waited long enough. The journey from Babylon to Jerusalem is no gentle stroll. You're talking about nearly 1,000 miles on foot, through deserts, over rivers, dodging bandits and scorpions, and the occasional philosophical crisis about whether you left the stove burning back in Babylon. But they go anyway. They go in droves. And here's where it gets interesting. This exodus, unlike the one from Egypt, isn't led by a Moses. There's no parting sea, no plagues, just lists of names. You find them in the book of Ezra, long genealogical lists of who returned, from which clan, and with how many camels, singers, and cooking pots. It's bureaucratic poetry. You skim through names like Zatu, Bani, Bebai, names that once echoed in exile and now walk under open sky. Historians still argue whether this first wave of returnees was massive or more like a symbolic trickle. Some estimates say 42,000 returned, others suspect it was fewer. Records are fuzzy, but the symbolism? That's undeniable. An entire people, carried off in shame, now walks back toward the mountain of the Lord, slow, dusty, and hungry, but free. Among the crowd is a man named Zerubbabel, a name you can't say 3 times fast without summoning a minor migraine. He's descended from David. Yes, that David, and though he doesn't have a crown, he's got authority. Alongside him is Jeshua, a high priest from the line of Aaron. Together, they're like a shadow government, a prototype monarchy priesthood duo stepping into ruined Jerusalem with sleeves rolled up and hearts full of blueprint dreams. When they arrive, the city looks like a bad memory. The temple is rubble, the walls are breached. Foxes dart across what used to be holy courtyards. But still, they start. First an altar, then the foundation. There's this haunting line in Ezra where the people shout for joy and weep at the same time when the foundation is laid. The older folks cry because the new version is nothing like Solomon's glory. The younger ones cheer because, well, at least it's not on fire. One fringe detail that always slips into the footnotes. Some believe a group of Levites sang psalms during the foundation ceremony using instruments smuggled out during the original destruction. No one can confirm this, of course, but imagine the scene. Ash and ivy covering broken walls. And there, under the open sky, someone tuning a harp older than the exile itself, singing a half-remembered melody into the wind. Not everyone's thrilled about this spiritual homecoming. By the way, the local Samaritans offer to help rebuild the temple, but they're turned away. Political, theological, maybe even personal reasons abound. The rejection sours quickly, and before long, opposition brews. Letters are sent to Persian governors claiming the Jews are planning to rebel. Construction halts. For nearly 2 decades, the foundation just sits there. A concrete dream deferred, quietly cracking under the weight of time and pessimism. Back in Babylon, word trickles down that the project has stalled. The faithful grow restless. Did God bring them this far just to stop? But Cyrus is gone now. His successors don't share his enthusiasm for temple building. Bureaucracy thickens, priests age, young people lose interest. Hope becomes a flickering candle, sometimes forgotten altogether. But a new scroll arrives, not from Cyrus this time, but from a prophet, a voice that calls across the hills, stirring old bones. His name is Haggai, and his message is simple. Is it time for you to live in paneled houses while the temple lies in ruins? You wince when you hear it. It hits a little too close to home. Suddenly, everyone is back on their feet, hauling stones, reforging community, rediscovering purpose. The temple eventually rises, not as grand as Solomon's, but sacred all the same. And though Cyrus has long since joined the ancestors, his name is still whispered in the wind as the man who made it possible, a foreign king who played a part in God's design, whether he knew it or not, and in quiet corners of the city. Some elders still keep his decree folded in a cloth, worn at the edges, but never forgotten. You find yourself wandering through the cooled stone corridors of a Persian palace, past golden columns and tapestries that flutter in an unseen breeze. The scent of rosewater lingers, as do rumors, whispers of a queen with 2 names. She walks these very halls, her face hidden behind veils of politics and perfume. Some call her Esther. Others know her by her Hebrew name, Hadassah. And behind every embroidered curtain lies a decision that could change the fate of an entire people. You pause near a bronze mirror, catching a ghost of your reflection as you imagine slipping into the role of a courtier in King Xerxes' grand palace at Susa. You try not to trip over your own sandals or spill your wine as lavish banquets stretch into the night. This isn't a place of restraint. It's a theater of indulgence, where loyalty is measured in toasts, and treason can be as simple as a poorly timed refusal. Hadassah doesn't belong here. Not really. She's told not to reveal her Jewish identity, which is already a precarious detail in an empire that has a track record of deporting or swallowing distinct cultures. But she keeps her secret. She learns the etiquette. She blends into the marbled walls, all while keeping her heritage tucked like a scroll beneath her heart. Enter Haman, the kind of guy you instantly don't trust, even if he offers you a second glass of wine. Haman's rise through the court ranks is fast, fueled by ego and a thirst for recognition. One man, Mordecai, refuses to bow. Just one. But to Haman, that's enough to justify an ancient grudge against the entire Jewish people. And so, like villains always do, he proposes a plan to erase an entire people group with bureaucratic efficiency. A decree is drafted, sealed, sent out to all 127 provinces. The date is set. The method is left deliberately vague, but everyone knows what's coming. It's in this storm of dread that Mordecai gets a message to Esther. You picture the scroll being smuggled in past guards and gossiping eunuchs. Unrolled with shaking hands, it says. More or less. This is why you're here. Don't think silence will save you. Esther's reply isn't immediate. She hesitates. Who wouldn't? Approaching the king without a summons is, well, a death sentence if he's in a bad mood, which, given Xerxes' track record, is about a 50-50 chance. But she agrees. First, though, she fasts, asks her people to do the same, not because it's strategy, because it's sacred. Then she dresses in her royal robes, layered silk, gold threading, the works, and walks into the throne room. The moment stretches like taut string. The king looks up. His eyes meet hers, and he lifts his golden scepter. She lives. What follows is a masterclass in subtlety and suspense. Esther doesn't cry or accuse. She invites, dines, waits. 2 banquets later, she drops the truth like a silent dagger. Her people are targeted, and the villain is sitting right there across the table, still holding his spoon. The timing is cinematic. Haman's downfall is swift. Mordecai is elevated, and the Jewish people, instead of being annihilated, are granted permission to defend themselves. They do, and they win. But here's the peculiar part. God's name is never mentioned. Not once in the entire book of Esther. No angels, no miracles, no flaming bushes. Just people, choices, and a series of coin flip decisions that, viewed together, feel anything but random. Some scholars say that's the point, that sometimes God's hand is hidden, not absent. That providence doesn't always come with trumpet fanfare or lightning bolts, but with veiled courage, sleepless nights, and wine spilled across trembling fingers. There's also a curious footnote in Persian tradition. Some legends outside the Bible remember a queen who changed the king's heart, who whispered justice into the ears of power. Could it be Esther, remembered through another lens? We can't know, but the echoes are there. Today, the festival of Purim still celebrates her bravery. People read her story aloud, cheer at her name, and boo loudly at Haman's. There's laughter and costumes and something called hamantaschen, triangular pastries meant to symbolize the villain's hat, or maybe his ears. It depends who you ask. And somewhere, deep beneath layers of history and half-forgotten holidays, a quiet girl with 2 names still walks the halls of memory. Esther, Hadassah, Queen, Orphan. hero. Human. She doesn't slay giants or split seas, but she saves a people by simply showing up, speaking when it mattered, and trusting that silence isn't always safe, in the end. You think about that mirror in the palace again. You remember your own reflection, blurred, hesitant, maybe even afraid, and you wonder what decision might be waiting just beyond your own hesitation. Veiled in robes, asking quietly to be made, you find yourself drifting deeper into the warmth of flickering torchlight, where wine flows like river water and golden goblets clink beneath silk-covered ceilings. This is Susa, the same royal city Esther walked through. But tonight, the spotlight isn't on her. It belongs to a man who may very well throw the most extravagant, ill-advised party in ancient history, King Xerxes. Yes, that Xerxes. The one Hollywood likes to depict with eyeliner and an overinflated god complex. Historically, he's both more boring and more complicated than that, which frankly makes him perfect for our sleepy retelling. You're ushered into the marble courtyard by the sounds of flutes and laughter, gold couches lined with purple fabric, mosaic floors so polished they double as mirrors, and everywhere, are servants carrying trays of food you've never seen, and drinks you definitely shouldn't trust on an empty stomach. The Book of Esther opens with this 6-month long festival thrown by Xerxes for his nobles. That's not a typo. 6 months, 180 days. That's not a party. That's a diplomatic strategy with catering. Now, this isn't just a social event. Xerxes is showing off. He's newly crowned, eager to flex his wealth, and about to launch a military campaign against Greece that desperately needs support. So he invites every official, satrap, and sandal-wearing politician in the empire to come be impressed. And, oh boy, are they ever. But somewhere between the bottomless wine policy and the let's all be impressed by the golden pillars portion of the event, Xerxes makes a mistake that echoes through history, not with swords or treaties, but with a poorly timed royal command. You see, after days of drinking, he decides it'd be a brilliant idea to summon Queen Vashti to appear before his guests, not just to say hello. The text is vague, but the context hints that it wasn't exactly a polite invitation for tea. Some say he wanted her to wear her crown, and only her crown, which, is not exactly the vibe for a state banquet. Vashti refuses. No fanfare, no excuses, just no. It's a quiet act of defiance that shakes the palace. A queen refusing a king? In public? The royal advisors panic. If word of this spreads, they argue. Every wife in the empire might suddenly have ideas. Can't have that. So Vashti is removed from her position, effectively exiled, and Xerxes, slightly hungover and deeply embarrassed, agrees. Thus begins the strangest search for a new queen ever recorded. You've probably heard of The Bachelor, but imagine it with royal scribes, forced makeovers, and an empire-wide decree. Young women from every province are gathered into the harem at Susa, given beauty treatments for an entire year. Yes, 12 months of oil massages and cosmetic scrubs, and then each one gets a single night with the king. Historians still debate how voluntary this contest really was. Some suggest many girls were taken unwillingly. Others argue some families might have pushed their daughters forward in hopes of social advancement. Whatever the case, it's Esther who catches the king's eye. Or maybe it was the way she didn't try too hard. The text says she found favor, not by ambition, but by grace. And here's where things get interesting. Xerxes chooses her, makes her queen, but never asks about her heritage. That's critical. Esther doesn't share that she's Jewish, because Mordecai told her not to. Maybe he feared backlash. Maybe he saw what happened to Vashti and figured silence was safer. Maybe silence was strategic. Meanwhile, Mordecai, still hanging around the palace gates like your cousin who can't take a hint, overhears a plot to assassinate the king. He reports it. The plot is foiled. The names are recorded in the royal chronicles, but he isn't rewarded. Not yet. It's one of those forgotten deeds that will matter much later. And then, Haman enters the scene. Yes, we touched on him before, but now we get the slow burn. Xerxes elevates Haman above all the other nobles. He's granted the king's signet ring. People are told to bow when he passes. Everyone complies, except Mordecai. And this is where Haman flips from ambitious to dangerous. It's not enough to punish Mordecai. He wants to annihilate his entire people. The way he spins it to Xerxes is chillingly bureaucratic. There's a group of people scattered throughout your provinces. They have different customs. They don't obey your laws. It's not in your interest to tolerate them. That's all it takes. The decree is signed. It's official. And here, beneath the political maneuvering, lies a historical tension worth noting. The Persian Empire was known, at least early on, for its tolerance of local religions and customs. That's part of why Cyrus was so admired. But now, with new kings and new advisors, things are shifting. Uniformity is beginning to trump pluralism, and the Jews, already a dispersed and distinct minority, find themselves once again cast as outsiders. The date for the annihilation is chosen by casting lots, Purim, in Hebrew. It's ironic that the villain's method of scheduling becomes the name of the holiday celebrating his failure. Classic. Word spreads. Panic follows. Mordecai dons sackcloth. Esther hears of the decree and, at first, hesitates. We've talked about her bravery, but let's sit with that hesitation for a second. She wasn't born fearless. She had to become brave. Sometimes, courage arrives like a wave. Other times, it tiptoes in, dragging its feet. And somewhere inside the palace, behind gilded doors and perfumed curtains, a young queen takes a breath and decides to do the one thing she was told not to do: act. It's easy to forget, as the story unfolds with such polish, that these events were terrifying. Real lives hung in the balance. Real fear clouded every sunrise. But that's what makes the story feel so human. Not because of divine thunderclaps, but because of people. Flawed, scared, unsure, who still chose to act. And in the dim corners of the palace, after the music fades and the guests stumble out, that first party, the one that started it all, lingers like a warning that sometimes the fate of nations turns not on battlefields, but in banquet halls, in whispered refusals, in a single word. No, the palace is quiet now. No trumpets, no velvet banquets. Just the muffled footsteps of a young woman pacing the marble floor, her pulse loud in her ears. You follow her through a narrow hallway, past thick stone columns, and into a room where prayers hang heavier than perfume. Esther is preparing herself, not with jewels or makeup, but with silence, fasting, 3 days of it. No bread, no wine, no laughter, just waiting, wondering. And then, the moment comes. She breathes deep, puts on her royal robes, and steps into the throne room uninvited. A death sentence, if Xerxes feels like having one of his famously unpredictable days. You watch from the shadows, holding your breath as the king looks up. A flicker of recognition, surprise, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, he lifts the scepter. Just like that. She lives, but she doesn't plead right away. She doesn't cry or shout. Instead, she smiles, asks for dinner. Come to a banquet, she says. Just you and Haman. Nothing alarming about that, right? Historians still puzzle over Esther's strategy here. Was it intentional stalling? Psychological maneuvering? Maybe she needed time. Maybe she wanted to put Haman at ease. Maybe she knew that even tyrants are more agreeable with full stomachs. Whatever her reason, it works. The first dinner passes. Food, wine, small talk that probably tasted like sand. Esther doesn't make her move. Instead, she invites them again. Come tomorrow, she says. One more banquet. Haman leaves glowing, drunk on power and vintage Shiraz. But outside the palace walls, Mordecai still refuses to bow. Haman notices, his ego bruised. He builds a gallows, 75 feet high, just to make a point. That's not justice, that's insecurity on stilts. That same night, sleep deserts the king. Maybe it's the wine, maybe it's something deeper. So he asks for the royal records, because nothing puts you back to sleep like official documentation. And there it is, the forgotten report about Mordecai foiling the assassination plot. The king blinks. Did we ever reward him? He asks. No, replies a very tired scribe. Just then, Haman strolls in, ready to ask for permission to hang Mordecai. Before he can speak, the king says, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman, ever modest, assumes it's about himself. "Oh," he says, "you should dress him in royal robes, put him on a royal horse, and have one of your top officials parade him through the city shouting his praises." The king smiles. Perfect. Do that for Mordecai. And so, the next morning, Haman leads a horse through the city, dragging his pride behind him like a broken sandal. You can hear the universe chuckling. That evening, at the second banquet, Esther finally speaks. She reveals everything, her identity, the threat against her people, and the man responsible, who just so happens to be sitting 2 seats away. Xerxes reacts not with rage at Esther, but at Haman. And here's the twist. In a moment of panicked begging, Haman flings himself across the couch where Esther reclines, just as the king walks back into the room. "Will he even assault the queen while I'm in the house?" Xerxes bellows. It's a rhetorical question. Guards appear, faces go pale, and Haman is taken away. Now, about that 75-foot gallows, guess who gets it instead? It's a brutal reversal, poetic in its symmetry, and one that brings a momentary sigh of relief. But the decree to destroy the Jews, it still exists, in Persian law. Royal decrees can't be revoked, even by the king, a detail that probably made lawyers both thrilled and terrified. So what now? Esther pleads again, risking the king's mood. This time, she doesn't ask him to undo the law. She asks for a new one, a counter-decree, one that gives her people the legal right to defend themselves. Xerxes agrees. Letters go out. Horses thunder across provinces. Scribes scramble to copy the message into every language and dialect in the empire. The Jews prepare, not for revenge, but for survival. When the day finally arrives, they fight and they win. What follows is not just victory, but celebration. The festival of Purim is born, a time of feasting, gifts and storytelling, a time to remember how fate can turn on something as small as a sleepless night or a queen's whisper. Even the casting of lots, the purr that Haman used to pick the execution date, becomes the namesake of a holiday that laughs in the face of fatalism. But here's the odd part. The part you feel like maybe you shouldn't say aloud in the candlelit hush of this narrative. God's name still isn't mentioned, not once. The entire book of Esther unfolds without a single overt reference to the divine. No prayers recorded, no miracles performed, just people, politics, wine, and boldness. Some say that's what makes it the most human of all biblical books. Others believe that the absence of God's name is the very thing that makes his presence felt all the more, that the divine moves through the cracks in history, through coincidences, ironies, and the long pauses between decisions. Still, others argue that it was a deliberate literary choice, a survival tactic, a way to tell a story in a foreign land without triggering censors or accusations of religious rebellion. Historians still argue whether Esther's tale was a polished court drama, a folk memory, or a sacred code for diaspora resilience. But whatever it was, it endures. In the hidden spaces of history, you often find the most illuminating light, not in loud declarations or fiery miracles, but in choices, small ones, risky ones, quiet ones. And perhaps that's why Esther matters, not just because she was brave, but because she was careful, strategic, wise, and still afraid. She teaches you that destiny doesn't always show up in a chariot of fire. Sometimes it walks in wearing perfume, waits for the right moment, and speaks softly in a room full of noise. The palace fades behind you, and now you're standing beneath a vast desert sky where the stars feel close enough to pluck like fruit. You're no longer in Susa or Babylon. Tonight, you drift into the shifting sands of a different story, one with dreams, lions, and the echo of footsteps pacing stone chambers. This is the world of Daniel, and Persia, once again, is the stage for something remarkable. You may remember Daniel as the dream interpreter from Babylonian days, the man who faced off with Nebuchadnezzar's madness, whose visions kept courtiers up at night, and who somehow always landed on his feet, no matter which empire rose or fell. But Daniel didn't vanish when Babylon did. When Cyrus swept into the city in 539 BCE, the Medo-Persian regime didn't start from scratch. Instead of purging Babylonian institutions, Cyrus and his successors adapted and absorbed them. This, too, was part of the Persian genius. Conquer gently, keep the bureaucracy, and rule like you'd always been there. Daniel, older now, perhaps in his 80s, was swept up into this transition. His wisdom, political savvy, and perhaps his reputation for being unusually calm around people who throw others into fire, made him invaluable. Under Darius the Mede, a name that still prompts historians to argue over its true identity, Daniel is appointed as one of 3 top administrators overseeing the entire empire. It's a promotion that sounds glamorous until you realize it means managing governors across 127 provinces, overseeing trade disputes, and calming nobles who think being taxed is a personal insult. And Daniel? He handles it all, efficiently, quietly, with a daily routine that hasn't changed since exile began, 3 times a day. He climbs the stairs, opens his windows toward Jerusalem, and prays. It's not loud, it's not performative, but it's consistent. And that's the problem. See, not everyone loves competence, especially not corrupt officials whose own work looks shabby next to Daniel's meticulous ledgers and clean track record. They search for something to accuse him of: embezzlement, treason, an unpaid library fine, but come up empty. So, in true ancient bureaucratic fashion, they decide to change the rules. They approach Darius with a flattering proposal. "O king, live forever. Let everyone pray only to you for 30 days. No gods, no men, just you. It's about loyalty, really." Darius, enjoying the sound of his own name echoed in reverence, agrees. He signs the decree, seals it with his ring, makes it law. They've got Daniel now, or so they think. Daniel hears the decree. He understands what it means. But the next morning, as always, he walks up the stairs, opens the windows, kneels down, and prays, just as he always has, not out of rebellion, not to be seen, but because faith, for him, doesn't change with policy. You can almost hear the rustle of his robe as he moves through familiar motions, like a river following its course no matter how the banks shift. The conspirators are waiting. Of course, they report him to the king immediately. Now comes the twist. Darius likes Daniel. He respects him, realizes, too late, that he's been manipulated. He spends the day trying to find a loophole in his own law, But Persian legal codes are as flexible as granite. What's signed is irreversible. As night falls, Darius gives the order, with great reluctance, that Daniel be thrown into the lion's den. He says, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." And then Daniel is lowered into the pit. Let's pause here for a second. Ancient Persia did use execution by wild animals, particularly under later rulers. But the specific logistics of lion dens being readily available in administrative buildings? That's a little fuzzy. Scholars still argue over whether this was literal, symbolic, or a dramatized retelling of a very real danger Daniel faced. Some think the lion's den may have been a metaphor for exile or political peril. Others suggest it was all quite literal, especially given Persia's fondness for exotic animals and spectacle. Back in the palace, Darius can't sleep. No music, no food, just silence and regret. At dawn, he hurries to the pit and shouts into the darkness, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to rescue you from the lions?" And from the shadows comes a calm reply, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions." Cue the relief, the ropes, the astonished gasps. Daniel is pulled out. No wounds, no torn clothes, not even a scratch. The lions, for whatever reason, seem to have lost their appetite. In true ancient poetic justice, the men who falsely accused Daniel and their households are then thrown into the same pit. The text does not shy away from that brutality. But again, the focus returns to Daniel, to his faith, to the idea that even in exile, even under foreign rule, integrity is possible and powerful. After this, Darius issues a new decree, that the God of Daniel be honored throughout the kingdom. It's a curious moment, not conversion, exactly, but respect, recognition, another Persian ruler bending toward reverence, just like Cyrus before him. Daniel's story doesn't end with lions or edicts. He continues to serve, to advise, and to dream. Oh, the dreams. Later chapters of the book read like apocalyptic fever dreams, beasts with horns, cosmic battles, timelines that may or may not predict the future. Some of these visions include Persia itself, depicted as a ram with two horns, eventually overtaken by a goat representing Greece. These chapters are rich with symbolism, layered with meaning, and frankly the kind of thing that makes theologians argue late into the night with way too much coffee. Some see these visions as literal predictions, others as coded resistance literature, meant to inspire Jews under foreign domination. Still others interpret them as philosophical reflections on empire, justice, and divine sovereignty. What's not debated, however, is Daniel's legacy. He stands as a symbol of unshaken faith, not dramatic, not showy, just deeply rooted. A man who served pagan kings without ever compromising his inner compass, who navigated multiple regimes, languages, and threats, but never stopped facing Jerusalem in prayer. And that image stays with you. An old man, quietly opening his window toward a city in ruins, whispering prayers into the wind, even when kingdoms rise and fall, even when lions wait, even when no one is watching. You find yourself walking along a path littered with broken stones, the kind of road that once led into the heart of a city, but now trails off into dry wind and faint memory. The sun is high, casting long shadows over piles of rubble. In the distance, you see a man standing near what looks like the remains of a wall. His robe is dusty, his hands are calloused, and his eyes carry the weight of a people's expectations. His name is Nehemiah, and he's come home to rebuild. Back in Persia, Nehemiah had a comfortable job. He was the king's cupbearer, basically the guy who made sure no one poisoned the wine. It's not glamorous, but it's trusted. You don't hand someone your goblet every night unless you believe they won't slip a little arsenic in the bottom. So when Nehemiah hears a report from Jerusalem, that the city lies in ruins, that its gates are burned, that its people are exposed. Something breaks inside him. He weeps, he fasts, he prays, and then he does something bold. He asks the Persian king, likely Artaxerxes, for permission to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Not just visit, not just send aid. He wants to organize, lead, and physically oversee the reconstruction of a city that still smolders in the memory of defeat. It's a risky ask. He could have been seen as stirring rebellion, but the king agrees. Not only that, he sends Nehemiah with letters of safe passage, military escort, and timber from the royal forests. It's one of those strange but persistent threads in history. Persian kings, over and over again, supporting Jewish restoration. Historians still puzzle over why. Was it policy? Piety? Politics? Maybe Persia saw the value in stabilizing its western frontiers. Or maybe these kings genuinely respected the God of Israel, or at least feared what might happen if they didn't. Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem quietly. No parades, no speeches, just a few men, a few animals, and a moonlit ride around the crumbling walls. He surveys the damage in silence. There's no Instagram post, no dramatic soundtrack, just a man taking mental notes, noting the gaps, the burnt beams, the way the stones seem to sigh when you step too close. The next day, he gathers the leaders, tells them, let's rebuild. Simple, direct, and somehow, it works. The people rally. Families take up trowels and hammers. Goldsmiths work beside perfumers, priests next to merchants. There's even a father-daughter duo patching up a gate near their house. It's a community project the size of a city. But not everyone's thrilled. Enter Sanballat and Tobiah, two regional officials who are, let's say, less than enthusiastic about Jerusalem's revival. They mock, they threaten, they write angry letters. At one point, Tobiah even sneers that if a fox jumped on the wall, it would crumble, which is a weird insult. But okay, as pressure mounts, Nehemiah does something brilliant. He splits the workforce. Half build, half guard. Picture it. Men laying stones with one hand and holding spears with the other. It's dusty. It's tense. And somehow, it's working, despite opposition, betrayal, and endless bureaucratic headaches. The walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt in just 52 days, less than 2 months. That's faster than it takes to remodel a kitchen these days. You can almost hear the collective exhale as the final gate swings into place. But Nehemiah isn't done. He doesn't just want stone walls. He wants spiritual foundations. So he teams up with Ezra, the priest scribe, and together they stage a kind of public Torah reading. Imagine a giant open-air service where the people gather in the square, listening to scripture read aloud from dawn until midday. Some haven't heard these words in years. Others never have. It's overwhelming. Many weep. Ezra and Nehemiah pause the tears. They tell the people not to mourn, but to rejoice. The joy of the Lord is your strength, they say. It's one of those verses that echoes down through centuries, quiet and enduring. Still, revival is messy. The people confess their sins. They fast. They make a covenant, promising to follow the law, avoid intermarriage, honor the Sabbath, and support the temple. It's a renewal, a national moment of recommitment, but it doesn't last forever. Eventually, Nehemiah leaves, called back to Persia for a while. When he returns, he finds compromise and corruption creeping back in. Temple rooms rented out to enemies. Levites neglected. Sabbath ignored. It's disheartening, like watching all your hard work slowly unravel. But instead of despairing, Nehemiah acts. Again, he throws out the unauthorized tenants. He confronts the leaders. He reminds the people of their covenant. He keeps pushing, not for perfection, but for faithfulness. Historians note that Nehemiah's leadership style is a bit intense. He pulls beards, he shouts, he prays, passionate, borderline desperate prayers like, "Remember me, oh my God, for good." It's not polished, but it's real. And that's what lingers, not the stones or the walls, which will eventually be knocked down again, not the ceremonies, which fade like incense on the wind, but the image of one man who saw a city in ruins and said, "Let's rebuild it anyway," who faced political resistance, spiritual apathy, and logistical nightmares, and kept going, who prayed not for fame, but for memory. So tonight, as the breeze tugs gently at your sleeve and the stars blink overhead like watchful eyes, you remember Nehemiah, not because he built something perfect, but because he built something when it felt easier to walk away. And maybe, just maybe, you carry a brick of that courage into your own story. You're moving now, not through a city or a palace, but across vast stretches of golden sand, where the desert hums with secrets and the wind whispers in ancient tongues. There are no kings here, no lion pits, just a caravan cutting slowly across the horizon, its camels swaying like ships on the sea. They carry spices, silk, and something rarer still, questions. Tonight, you follow the footsteps of the Magi, those mysterious wise men from the East who appear only briefly in the Gospel of Matthew, bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh for a child in Bethlehem, and then vanishing just as suddenly into legend. It's a short appearance, really, just a few verses, but it opens the floodgates to centuries of speculation, songs, and paintings. But where did they come from? The Bible simply says they came from the East. But that phrase isn't very specific to people living in first century Judea. The East could mean Arabia, Babylon, or, perhaps most intriguingly, Persia, the land we now call Iran. The word Magi itself is rooted in the Greek magoi, which comes from the Old Persian magush. It referred to a priestly class within Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of ancient Persia. These weren't just fortune tellers or stage magicians. The Magi were learned scholars, astrologers, keepers of sacred knowledge, and often royal advisors. If anyone was going to notice something strange in the sky and think it meant a king was being born, it would be them. Zoroastrians, like the Hebrews, were monotheistic, or at least dualistic. They believed in a supreme deity named Ahura Mazda and a cosmic battle between truth, Asha, and falsehood, Druj. They valued righteousness, justice, and light, and, importantly, they were obsessed with the stars, not for entertainment, but because they believed the heavens revealed divine patterns. The sky was a scroll waiting to be read. So, when the Magi say they saw his star in the east, they weren't watching for fireworks. They were decoding what they believed to be sacred signs. Modern scholars have tried to figure out what they might have seen. Some point to a rare conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation Pisces around 7 BCE, which ancient astrologers connected to kingship, rebirth, and the Jewish people. Others think it might have been a comet or a supernova. A few even suggest it wasn't a real star at all, but a spiritual sign, one seen only by those meant to see it. Whatever it was, it moved them. Now. Imagine that journey, hundreds of miles across treacherous terrain, through mountain passes and arid plains, camels loaded with supplies, nights spent under open skies, tracking stars across parchment maps, no GPS, no fast food, just instinct, tradition, and a growing sense that something holy waited at the end of the road. But why would Zoroastrian priests care about a Jewish prophecy? Why leave their homeland to visit a baby in a far-off village? The answer may lie in the long, winding relationship between Persia and the Jewish people. ever since Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. There had been contact, cultural, religious, and political. Jewish communities had flourished in Persian lands. Ideas had traveled along trade routes and through shared exile. The Jewish scriptures, or at least stories from them, may have reached Persian scholars. They may have read of a promised ruler who would shepherd not just Israel, but the nations. Perhaps they connected the dots or the stars and decided it was time to go. Historians still argue over the identity of the Magi. Were they real historical figures or narrative symbols? Were they Persian priests, Babylonian scholars, or Arabian philosophers? Some early Christian writers named them and even gave them backstories: Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar. But those names come centuries later and are more poetic than historical. Still, the link to Persia remains strong in many traditions. There's even an Armenian legend that says the Magi returned home and eventually converted to Christianity. Another fringe theory suggests that they may have seen the birth of Christ as the fulfillment of their own prophetic traditions, especially the Zoroastrian belief in a coming savior, or Saoshyant, who would bring about the final defeat of evil and restore the world to goodness. It's a tantalizing idea that different religious streams, flowing from different lands, might have converged quietly in a stable in Bethlehem. And then there are the gifts: gold, frankincense, myrrh. Not random trinkets, not cheap souvenirs. These were royal gifts, priestly symbols, and burial perfumes. Gold for a king, frankincense, burned in the temple for worship, myrrh, used in embalming, for death. Did the Magi understand the symbolism, or did they just bring what was customary for honoring someone of great importance? We don't know, and maybe that's the point. The Magi's visit isn't about answers. It's about seeking, about crossing borders in pursuit of light, about kneeling in reverence before something they didn't fully understand and giving generously anyway. They didn't stay. They didn't evangelize. They didn't write a memoir. They gave their gifts, worshipped quietly, and went home by another road, warned in a dream not to return to Herod. And that's it. No fame, no credit, just the quiet satisfaction of having arrived. You sit with that for a moment. How often do we look for dramatic endings, for applause, for certainty? But the Magi's story is a reminder that sometimes the journey itself is the point, that following the faintest flicker of light might be enough, that mystery isn't something to solve, but to honor, and maybe, just maybe, somewhere back in ancient Persia, in a temple with a sacred flame that never went out, a scroll was written in private, telling of a time when their wisest men followed a star and found something greater than they had ever imagined. You're standing now in a quiet courtyard, not in Jerusalem, not in Bethlehem, but in a Zoroastrian fire temple somewhere deep in the Persian plateau. The smell of sandalwood clings to the air. A single flame burns in the center, protected behind glass, tended carefully by white-robed priests. They move silently, almost rhythmically, as if the fire has its own heartbeat and they're just keeping time. This is sacred space. And tonight, the question flickers like the flame itself. What happens when two ancient faiths meet? Zoroastrianism and Judaism, so different in form, and yet, at moments in history, they brushed shoulders more intimately than we often realize. When the Jews were exiled into Babylon and later absorbed into the Medo-Persian world, they didn't just bring their scrolls and memories, they brought their theology. And the Persians had plenty of their own. Zoroastrians believed in one supreme deity, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, but they also saw the universe as a battleground between two cosmic forces, Asha, truth, order, light, and Druj, deceit, chaos, darkness. This dualism wasn't just philosophical, it shaped everything from law to ritual, fire, ever pure and untouchable. Was the symbol of Asha not something to worship, but a signpost pointing toward purity? Now imagine a Jewish exile, raised on stories of the burning bush and the fiery pillar in the wilderness, stepping into a Persian temple for the first time and seeing a sacred fire that never goes out. There's no idolatry here, no golden calves, just quiet reverence. Maybe it stirred something. Maybe it unsettled everything. Historians still debate the level of cross-influence. Some argue that Jewish thought, especially apocalyptic literature written during or after the Persian period, shows traces of Zoroastrian ideas, angels with names and duties, a final judgment, resurrection of the dead, a cosmic war between good and evil. Others caution against drawing too straight a line. The Hebrews had their own theological framework long before exile, but the timing is intriguing. The shift from earlier Hebrew writings, which focus mostly on this worldly justice, to later ones filled with visions of heaven, hell, and future hope. Well, let's just say the desert wasn't the only thing influencing Jewish imagination. And then there's the Book of Enoch, a non-canonical Jewish text that reads like an apocalyptic fever dream. Angels with strange names, heavenly journeys, divine courtrooms. It was written during or just after the Persian period. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe not. Meanwhile, the Persians were absorbing as well. After centuries of contact, Jewish communities dotted Persian cities, scrolls passed hands, debates echoed through back alleys and libraries. There's even a curious theory, fringe, but fascinating, that some Zoroastrian priests may have begun to adopt certain Jewish ideas, especially around moral purity and messianic hope. The boundary between us and them wasn't always as thick as modern textbooks make it seem. One of the clearest intersections is the shared expectation of a coming figure in Zoroastrianism. It's the Saoshyant, a future savior who would lead the final battle against evil and restore the world. He would be born of a virgin, it was said, miraculously conceived, and destined to raise the dead and judge all souls. Sound familiar? In Judaism, this idea of a Messiah, the Mashiach, also evolves during the exile. No longer just a king like David, the Messiah begins to take on cosmic importance. He becomes not just a national leader, but a redeemer, someone who would defeat evil, restore Israel, and maybe, just maybe, heal the world. Did these ideas feed into one another? Did Jewish scribes and Persian priests sit across from each other under oil lamps, trading verses like merchants trading silk? We can't say for sure, but the overlap is striking. There's also the question of ritual. Jewish purity laws, washing, avoiding contact with certain things, dietary restrictions, were deeply tied to holiness. In Zoroastrianism, purity was also paramount. The rituals were different, but the core idea was the same. Cleanliness wasn't just hygiene, it was a form of worship. Even funerary practices, so different on the surface, reveal hidden parallels. Jews buried their dead with care, often awaiting future resurrection. Zoroastrians placed bodies in towers of silence, exposing them to the elements and birds, to avoid contaminating earth or fire. Both traditions, though wildly different, stemmed from a deep respect for the body and an awareness that death was more than just biology. It was a passage, a hinge between worlds, one especially quirky overlap. Both groups had complex rules about where and how you could use the bathroom. Yes, really, you weren't just relieving yourself, you were navigating sacred space. You had to be mindful of direction, distance from water sources, and in some cases, spiritual consequences. Fringe? Absolutely. But revealing. There's also a shared reverence for speech. In Judaism, words create. God speaks the world into existence. In Zoroastrianism, Asha, truth, is not just a virtue, but a force that upholds reality. To lie is to unravel the cosmos. To speak rightly is to build it. You can almost hear echoes across the languages, like two poets writing different stanzas of the same epic. But of course, not all was harmony. There were theological tensions, too. Judaism was fiercely monotheistic. The God, not a god. Zoroastrian dualism, with its cosmic tug-of-war, could seem dangerously close to blasphemy. There were debates, likely fiery ones, about fate, free will, and the nature of evil. Did evil exist independently? Or was it simply the absence of good? Did light always need darkness to shine? And yet, despite the friction, both traditions held on to one stubborn hope, that this world, broken and flickering, could still be healed, that justice wasn't a myth, that truth would prevail, that a better day was coming. So tonight, you sit beside a flickering flame, not your own, but familiar. You watch the shadows dance, and you wonder what happens when fires from different altars cast overlapping light. Maybe history isn't just conflict and conquest. Maybe sometimes it's quiet borrowing, shared questions, parallel prayers spoken in different languages toward the same silent sky. The sun beats down over an endless plain of stone and dust. But this is no empty desert. If you listen closely, you'll hear the steady shuffle of sandals, the rhythmic groan of ox carts, and the clink of bronze coin purses tied to merchant belts. This is not just any road. It's part of the grand artery system of the Persian Empire. And tonight, you walk alongside traders, soldiers, scribes, and prophets who journeyed these routes long before asphalt and motorways. Welcome to the Royal Road, where every step hums with history, stretching over 1,500 miles. The Royal Road was more than a path. It was a marvel, built under the reign of Darius III and maintained by generations of Persian administrators. It connected Sardis near the Aegean Sea to the capital city of Susa in Elam, with relay stations and supply depots spaced every few miles. It allowed for incredibly efficient communication, transport, and travel in a world where most people never left their village. It was, in a sense, Persia's circulatory system, and like blood through veins, it carried ideas as much as it did goods, alongside the imperial couriers galloping from station to station. You'd find a more diverse crowd, traders in linen tunics, leading camels heavy with myrrh and spices, diplomats muttering under their breath as they revised speeches in Aramaic, local villagers offering dates or roasted chickpeas at roadside stalls, and, perhaps somewhere in the dusty margins, a Jewish exile returning home, or not yet sure whether to return at all. For Jews living under Persian rule, these roads were both literal and symbolic. After Cyrus the Great issued his famed decree allowing them to return to Jerusalem, many did, but many didn't. Babylon, Susa, Ecbatana, these cities had become home. Generations were born and buried there. So, instead of a mass exodus, what unfolded was more complex. A web of connections. Some left, some stayed, some traded between the two worlds, and the Royal Road stitched all of them together. The Jews who remained in Persia were not simply forgotten remnants. They became merchants, scholars, and advisors. They navigated court politics, ran businesses, and maintained their customs in the heart of a foreign land, in cities like Susa and Persepolis. They established small communities, synagogues, if not made of stone, formed in living rooms. Torah scrolls were copied by candlelight. Children learned Hebrew and Aramaic side by side. One fascinating artifact of this period is the Elephantine Papyri, a collection of Jewish writings found on an island in Egypt, dating from the 5th century BCE, during Persian rule, while not Persian per se. It reflects the Jewish diaspora under imperial oversight. Contracts, letters, and petitions, all written in careful Aramaic, show a people adapting to empire while clinging to identity. It's likely that similar documents once passed along the Royal Road, carried in saddlebags or hidden beneath tunics. Coins also tell part of this story. Persian coins typically bore the image of a warrior king, bow in hand. They were symbols of authority, precision, and order, but under Persian rule. Judea eventually minted its own coins, simple designs, often with inscriptions in Paleo-Hebrew script. A pomegranate here, a lily there. These weren't rebellions in metal. They were affirmations of faith, statements that, even under empire, identity endures. Historians still debate how much influence the Persian government had on the shaping of Jewish religious life during this period. Some believe that the support of Persian rulers allowed Judaism to shift from temple-centered ritual to a more text-centered, law-focused faith. Ezra's reforms, Nehemiah's rebuilding, the codification of Torah. None of these happened in a vacuum. They unfolded within the framework of Persian policy and, perhaps, under its watchful approval, and the road made it all possible. Through this system, priests and prophets could move between cities. Letters could reach distant communities. Edicts could be enforced, but so too could scripture be taught. The prophet Malachi, for example, writes from a time when Persian governance looms in the background. He critiques the corruption of priests, the fading zeal of worshippers, and the creeping compromises of a people too long under foreign rule. His voice, while grounded in Judea, echoes the broader discontent of a community suspended between worlds. Even the rise of synagogues, gathering places for prayer and teaching, likely owes something to the decentralized, mobile life of Jews in the Persian Empire, with the temple far away or destroyed. Jews had to adapt. They prayed in homes, in courtyards, perhaps even in caravan tents set up beside the road, with the stars above as their ceiling. And then there's the language, Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Persian Empire, gradually became the daily language of many Jews in exile. It was the language of trade, governance, and, eventually, portions of the Bible itself, the book of Daniel, Ezra, and parts of Jeremiah are written in Aramaic. That shift didn't happen by accident. It was the natural outcome of living under empire, of sharing space with other nations, and finding new words for old truths. It's in these crossroads, these dusty way stations between capitals, that ideas moved most freely. A Persian governor might sit down beside a Jewish elder and share figs while discussing local politics. A Hebrew merchant might trade silver for silk and end up swapping stories with a Zoroastrian priest. Theology wasn't a battleground here. It was a slow dance, tense at times, but often surprisingly civil. One particularly curious tradition says that the Magi, those wise men we met earlier, may have traveled these very roads en route to Judea. If true, that makes this highway not just a channel for empire, but a corridor of prophecy. From the fires of Persian temples to the hills of Bethlehem, the royal road becomes, in hindsight, a kind of artery of mystery. So as night falls along this ancient path, and the wheels creak to a halt for rest, you sit beside the embers of a campfire. Someone nearby hums a lullaby in a language you half understand. Someone else counts coins by firelight. A child asks to hear again the story of Jerusalem, of the temple that once was and might be again, and the stars above, silent as always, seem to nod, because even here, on the road built by kings, it's the quiet persistence of exiles, their prayers, their scrolls, their stories, that endure. The wind carries the sound of rustling parchment through Jerusalem's dusty courtyards, like dry leaves stirring under sandal feet. You're no longer on the roads or at the palaces. You've arrived at a moment when history doesn't explode. It unfolds. It's not led by armies or chariots this time, but by a man with ink-stained fingers and scrolls tied with string. His name is Ezra, and he is here not to conquer, but to remember. Ezra is a scribe. That doesn't sound impressive at first. He's not a king. He doesn't swing swords or build walls, but don't be fooled. He may just be one of the most influential figures in Jewish history. He arrives in Jerusalem with a mission as radical as any general's: to restore a scattered people by restoring their law, their memory, and their identity, not through force, but through Scripture. You follow him as he walks slowly through the city gates, carrying with him a small company of priests, Levites, temple servants, and families, all returning from Babylonian exile. His journey was sanctioned by the king of Persia himself, likely Artaxerxes IV, who issued a formal decree. Ezra isn't sneaking back into Jerusalem under cover of night. He's got official documents, legal immunity, and the full weight of the Persian Empire behind him. Strange, isn't it, that a Zoroastrian king, ruling over hundreds of gods and dozens of cultures, would empower a Jewish priest to teach Mosaic law? But this wasn't an accident. It was policy. Persian rulers understood that local autonomy often produced loyalty. And if Judea could be stabilized through religion and community law, then why not let it happen? Ezra's task is clear: bring the law of Moses back into public life. But that task is anything but simple. After decades in exile, the Jewish people are fractured. Some have intermarried. Some don't speak Hebrew anymore. Others have never even heard the Torah read aloud. They're home, technically, but spiritually, they're still wandering. So Ezra begins, as any good scribe would, with the scrolls. The scene unfolds in Jerusalem's main square. It's early morning. The people gather, thousands of them, farmers in tunics, children clutching their fathers' robes, elderly men leaning on staffs, and Ezra steps onto a wooden platform. In his hands is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the text that shaped their ancestors, that they had forgotten or had never known. And then he reads, line by line, word by word, for hours, and the people weep. They cry not out of boredom or fatigue, but because they recognize what's been lost, the covenant, the identity, the rhythm of their lives, once ordered by Sabbath and sacrifice, had faded into the daily noise of exile. And now, like a melody half remembered, it returns. But this isn't just nostalgia. Ezra isn't trying to recapture a golden age. He's introducing something new, what some scholars call the beginning of Second Temple Judaism, a faith rooted not only in temple ritual, but in text, in reading, in learning, in the ability to carry God's word even when the temple falls. Historians still debate just how much of the Torah was compiled or canonized by Ezra. Was he editing existing texts, finalizing traditions, assembling scraps from oral memory and older scrolls? There's no consensus, but there's agreement that something changed here, permanently. The Jewish people were becoming a people of the book, not just in title, but in daily practice. And this new practice needed structure. Ezra not only read the law, he taught it. Levites moved through the crowd, translating the Hebrew into Aramaic for those who no longer understood the original tongue. They didn't just interpret the language, they explained the meaning. It was the first recorded instance of something we now call midrash, commentary, interpretation. The act of making ancient words speak to current lives. One quirky detail, according to tradition, Ezra even created a kind of proto-synagogue, with the temple in disrepair and many people unable to travel to Jerusalem regularly. Gathering in smaller, local settings to read and teach the Torah became essential. Over time, these gatherings would become formalized. And so, thanks in part to Ezra, Jewish worship slowly shifted from sacrifice-centered ritual to text-centered study, a model that continues to this day. And what of the Persians? They didn't just tolerate this religious revival, they encouraged it. Artaxerxes' decree gave Ezra authority not only to teach, but to appoint judges and enforce the law of God. Even tax exemptions were granted to temple workers and scribes. Imagine that. a foreign empire underwriting the spiritual and legal renewal of a nation they had conquered, and faith would endure because it was written, read, and remembered. You picture him now, old and tired, rolling up the scrolls after another long day of teaching. Maybe his voice is hoarse. Maybe his eyes blur from reading too long by torchlight. But his hands are steady, the ink dry, the words safe. The people still stumble. They still forget. But the law, the covenant, it's back. And not even empire can erase it now. It's nearly dusk now, and a quiet stillness begins to settle over Jerusalem. The marketplace has emptied. The last rays of sun stretch long and golden across the rooftops, casting flickering shadows on stone walls that still carry the warmth of the day. But amid this gentle hush, if you listen closely, you'll hear something else stirring, something older, sharper, yet somehow comforting. The voices of the prophets, not kings, not priests, not warriors, just prophets, dusty, worn, and stubborn as ever. Tonight, we walk alongside 3 of them, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Their scrolls are shorter than the grand sermons of Isaiah or the poetic sorrow of Jeremiah, but their impact is no less lasting. These men spoke not during war or exile, but after, during the long, uncomfortable silence that follows a return home that doesn't feel quite like home. When the exile ends but the hardship doesn't, when you have your land back, your temple walls slowly rising again, but somehow your soul still feels scattered, and into that space they speak. Let's begin with Haggai. Haggai doesn't waste time. He arrives with a message that cuts through the murmur of excuses and complaints. You say, "It's not time to rebuild the Lord's house," he says, "but look around you. You're living in paneled houses while the temple lies in ruins." The people had returned from exile. Yes, but their priorities were skewed. Their focus had turned inward, to rebuilding their homes, their farms, their security, all understandable, but in the process, they had sidelined the very reason they came back, to restore their covenant with God. Haggai's call is urgent, almost confrontational, but it works. Something stirs in the people. They gather timber, they haul stones, they restart construction on the second temple, a project that had been stalled for years. The rebuilt temple wouldn't have Solomon's gold or grandeur, but Haggai reassures them with a curious promise. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former. Historians still argue about what he meant. Did he foresee a future spiritual fulfillment? A messianic age? Or was he simply pointing out that faithfulness means more than architecture? Next comes Zechariah. If Haggai is a builder, Zechariah is a dreamer. His scroll reads like a riddle wrapped in moonlight. He sees visions, strange, swirling, layered. 4 horsemen patrolling the earth, a flying scroll, a woman in a basket carried off by storks, a golden lampstand fed by 2 olive trees. His words require careful unpacking, line by line, symbol by symbol. But the heart of Zechariah's message is clear. Return. Return to me, God says through him, and I will return to you. Zechariah is not just warning the people not to repeat their ancestors' mistakes. He's inviting them into a deeper relationship, a personal restoration. One of his most famous prophecies speaks of a humble king riding on a donkey, bringing peace. Later, the gospel writers would point to this verse when describing Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. But in Zechariah's own day, it likely sounded like a distant dream, a peaceful king in the age of Persia, with soldiers patrolling the walls and taxes squeezing every corner of life. And yet, he insists the king will come, not with war horses, but with gentleness. His vision is expansive. He sees Jerusalem becoming a city without walls, not because it's vulnerable, but because it's overflowing. He speaks of a day when even the cooking pots in Jerusalem will be inscribed with holiness. It's a vision of total transformation, where the sacred seeps into every corner of life, where no act, however mundane, is outside the reach of redemption. And then, finally, comes Malachi. His voice is quieter, more measured, almost tired. He isn't painting grand images, he's holding up a mirror. His tone is part teacher, part disappointed friend. The people have returned, the temple is rebuilt, but their hearts are drifting. They bring blind animals for sacrifice. They mutter, "What a burden." When it's time to worship, the priests are lax, the people are cynical. Malachi doesn't shout, he questions. Where is the respect due to God? He asks, why do you rob God in tithes and offerings? He challenges them on marriage, on justice, on faithfulness, but even as he rebukes, he ends on a note of hope. He speaks of a coming messenger who will prepare the way, of a refining fire that will purify the people, of the sun of righteousness rising with healing in its wings. It's subtle, but the imagery is warm, like dawn breaking after a long, cold night, a reminder that renewal doesn't always arrive in a flood. Sometimes it comes like sunlight through cracked windows. What links all three prophets is not just their message, but their moment. They lived during a strange season of history, after the return from Babylon, during the shadow of Persian oversight. It was a time when the people of Judah were neither slaves nor sovereign. They had their city, but not their king, their temple, but not their independence, their scrolls, but not the clarity they once had. And Persia? Always in the background. The empire didn't suppress them, but it didn't exactly cheer them on either. They were tolerated, managed, allowed to practice their religion as long as they kept the peace and paid their dues. And it was in that tension, in that in-between space, that the prophets found their voice. Historians still discuss whether Persian policies influenced prophetic tone. Was their message tempered by imperial pressure, or empowered by the space Persian tolerance provided? No clear answers. You find yourself drifting eastward again, past the familiar cities and rivers of the Persian heartland, into lands less mapped, less named, and more imagined. The hills become rugged, the air thinner. There are fewer roads now, and even fewer signs. But stories cling to this place like dust on sandals. Stories of people who vanished long ago, lost, but never quite forgotten. Stories of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. It begins with the fall of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE. The Assyrian Empire swept through Israel, capturing its cities and deporting most of its population. These exiles, unlike their southern cousins from Judah, never came back. No grand return, no rebuilding of their temple, no book of Ezra to tell their tale, just silence, a hole in the narrative that somehow grew larger with time. 10 entire tribes, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh, swept into exile, swallowed by empire. And yet, their memory persisted over the centuries. The theories multiplied. Some claimed the tribes had migrated to the mountains of Media, present-day Western Iran. Others said they had crossed rivers unknown to the rest of the world. There's the famous tale of the Sambatyon, a roaring river that hurled stones 6 days a week and rested on the Sabbath. A river, legend said. That marked the boundary between the known world and the one where the tribes still lived. There are even tales recorded in the Talmud and Midrash that suggest the tribes would return one day, at the end of days, to reclaim their place in Israel's destiny, not as stragglers, but as a full nation, preserved for a purpose. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were theological anchors, proof that God's promises hadn't failed, only paused. Persian Jews had their own versions. Some believed they themselves were descended from those tribes, or had at least intermarried with them over time. Others told of distant communities in the mountains of Elam and beyond who practiced Jewish customs without knowing why. They didn't have scrolls or teachers, but they avoided pork. They prayed toward the west. They celebrated new moons. It was faith in fragments, enough to intrigue, but never enough to prove. Fringe theories stretch even farther. Some claim the lost tribes migrated eastward for centuries, eventually settling in India, China, even Japan. Others link them to the Pashtun tribes of Afghanistan, whose customs, codes of honor, ritual purity, and even some oral genealogies bear tantalizing similarities to ancient Israelite life. Skeptics roll their eyes, but the stories persist because people want them to. The lost tribes aren't just a mystery, they're a mirror. Every generation projects its fears and hopes onto them. In the Middle Ages, they became symbols of Jewish strength in exile. In the modern era, they've inspired missions, theories, and novels. In Ethiopia, the Beta Israel community held that they were descended from the tribe of Dan. In Japan, 19th century scholars tried to find linguistic ties between Shinto chants and Hebrew psalms. And yet, the core of the story remains here, somewhere in the eastern lands ruled by Persia. Because Persia, with its tolerance and its massive reach, could have been the perfect shelter for a remnant, a place where the tribes, though scattered, were not erased, where Jewish exiles and ancient Israelites brushed shoulders in markets, shared wells, maybe even intermarried, where traditions mingled and mutated and survived. There's no definitive proof, of course, no scroll unearthed that says, "Hello from the tribe of Naphtali." But that hasn't stopped the search, because the lost tribes are not just about history, they're about identity, about belonging, about the ache we feel when something precious is missing and we don't know where to look. You sit now beneath a cedar tree, far from Jerusalem. The stars above you are the same ones Abraham once counted. The wind that brushes your face once filled the sails of Persian ships. And somewhere beyond the hills, in a village with no name on any modern map, someone lights a lamp and whispers an ancient blessing in a language that sounds like Hebrew, but isn't quite. And maybe that's where they are, not lost, just waiting. You're standing now among scorched stones and silent columns, on the blackened steps of what was once a throne room. The air still smells faintly of ash, though centuries have passed. Beneath your feet lie the cracked remnants of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. And in the silence, you can almost hear it, the sound of torches being dropped, of soldiers shouting in foreign tongues, of scrolls curling into flame. This is where the empire of Persia met its reckoning, and its name was Alexander, Alexander of Macedon, whom history would crown the Great, entered the Persian story not as a visitor, but as a storm. His armies crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BCE, and over the next decade, he dismantled what had stood for 200 years. He didn't just conquer territory, he rewrote geography, tore down kings, and redrew lines of identity that had stood since Cyrus the Great first bent Babylon to his will. But this isn't just a story of battles. This is about prophecy, or at least, the belief that prophecy and empire were somehow intertwined. In the book of Daniel, written centuries earlier, during Persian rule, there's a vision of a ram and a goat. The ram has 2 horns, and no beast can stand before it. Then a goat comes from the west without touching the ground, moving swiftly, and strikes the ram, shattering its horns. The goat is said to have a single powerful horn, which later breaks and is replaced by 4 smaller ones. Historians still debate whether this vision predicted Alexander's rise, or whether it was written after his conquests and retrofitted as prophecy. Either way, the symbolism is hard to miss. The 2-horned ram, almost certainly the Medo-Persian Empire, the fast-moving goat, a striking image of Alexander's lightning campaign from the west, the broken horn, Alexander's sudden death, and the four that follow, his generals, who split his empire. Daniel's vision, real or constructed after the fact, captured something deeper, the idea that no empire, no matter how vast or golden, is untouchable, that the rise and fall of nations are not just political accidents, but woven into divine narrative. And so, when Alexander rode into Persia, many in the Jewish world saw not just a conqueror, but a confirmation. The goat had come. You walk through what remains of Persepolis, past broken griffins and toppled columns that once bore the weight of imperial dreams. Alexander had initially admired Persian culture. He even adopted some of its customs, dressed in Persian robes, and married a Persian noblewoman, Roxana. But then came the fire. The burning of Persepolis is still a matter of debate. Was it drunken revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century earlier? A calculated political message? Or simply chaos unleashed? Either way, the city was consumed, its treasure halls looted, its royal audience chambers reduced to cinders, and with that, Persia's flame was snuffed out, not just as a military power, but as a defining narrative. But what about the Jews? Interestingly, Alexander's relationship with the Jewish people was not one of conquest. According to legend, likely embellished but deeply meaningful, he spared Jerusalem. One version says he was met by the high priest, dressed in white, who showed him the book of Daniel and the prophecy about the goat. Alexander, apparently impressed by the idea that his rise had been foretold, honored the city. Some sources say he offered sacrifices in the temple. Others claim he allowed the Jews to retain their laws and customs. Historians remain cautious about these accounts, but the legend itself reveals something important, that the Jewish people saw Alexander's rise not just as a threat, but as a continuation of divine story, a new chapter in the same book. Of course, what followed was more complicated. Alexander's empire didn't last long. He died in 323 BCE, just 32 years old. In Babylon, no heir, no plan. His generals carved up the empire like vultures around a carcass. In Persia, the satraps, the provincial governors, lost their power. Greek language and culture began to seep into the cracks left behind, and the old Zoroastrian order, already weakened, began to wither. But for Jewish communities in Persia, life continued, not without tension. Hellenistic influence brought new philosophies, new art, and sometimes uncomfortable compromises. But Judaism had already learned how to survive under empire. It had survived Babylon. It had adapted under Persia. It would endure under Greece. And the idea of prophecy? It didn't go away. In fact, it expanded. The apocalyptic literature that blossomed after Alexander's conquests, books like Enoch, Jubilees, and parts of Daniel, speak of kingdoms rising and falling, of beasts with horns and crowns, of heavenly thrones and final judgments. These texts aren't just spiritual musings. They are political theology, responses to empire, warnings that even the mightiest rulers are still under divine scrutiny. You walk now through a ruined gateway, once gilded, now weathered by wind. The stones here do not speak Greek. They remember Persian names, but those names are fading. The empire Cyrus built, Darius expanded, and Xerxes paraded across, lies in pieces, and yet the scrolls endure. The Jewish people did not burn when Persepolis did. Their covenant did not shatter with the columns. Their law, re-established by Ezra, interpreted by scholars, and carried by hand from one corner of the empire to another, remained intact. Even Alexander, for all his ambition, did not undo what exile could not. One quirky tradition says that some Persian Jews saw Alexander not just as a conqueror, but as a kind of temporary Messiah, not the true Redeemer, but a placeholder, a powerful figure used by God to shift the world toward its next chapter. Not adored, not feared, just allowed. Historians still argue whether the book of Daniel truly foresaw Alexander, but for those who lived under his shadow, the symbolism mattered more than precision. It said, "We are not forgotten." The fall of empires does not mean the end of covenant, and as you step beyond the ruins, into the twilight of empire, that truth lingers like incense. Kings rise, cities burn, but the scroll is still unrolled, and the story continues. The road stretches before you, but now, instead of carved stone reliefs or marble courtyards, you're walking across a quieter, more abstract path, one paved not with bricks, but with memory, imagination, and centuries of religious longing. You've left the torchlit scrolls of ancient empires behind. Ahead lies something more elusive. This is Iran, not just as a kingdom that once sheltered exiles and toppled Babylon, but as a nation that continues to stir curiosity, reverence, and a peculiar blend of biblical awe and political tension. A country layered in prophecy, wrapped in paradox. We began with Cyrus the Great, a pagan king called God's Anointed, and we end with a modern state still carrying the name of that ancient empire, different in every conceivable way, yet somehow still connected by the geography of biblical memory. Isn't that strange? That while Babylon is mostly dust and museum labels, Iran remains living, breathing, contentious. It appears in headlines and homilies alike. Some point to ancient verses, trying to fit modern Iran into Ezekiel's or Daniel's visions. Others roll their eyes, and yet, the connection refuses to fade. Some Christian eschatologists look to Ezekiel 38 to 39, those apocalyptic chapters about a coalition of nations rising against Israel, and see Persia named among the adversaries. It's a detail easy to miss in the Hebrew scrolls, but hard to ignore once you've spotted it. They draw maps, assign roles, and trace alliances. Persia equals Iran. Magog might be Russia. The scenario builds, verse by verse. Never mind that Ezekiel lived in exile, writing visions that blurred dreams with political commentary. The desire to see patterns, divine blueprints, remains powerful, and it's not just outsiders looking in. Within Iran, history is a living thing. The name Cyrus still holds cultural weight. His tomb at Pasargadae still draws pilgrims, not just historians, but ordinary Iranians who feel some strange, ancestral pull, though modern Iranian leadership sometimes suppresses pre-Islamic symbols. They never fully disappear. There's pride in knowing your civilization once spanned 3 continents, that your kings are named in the Bible not just as enemies, but as instruments of deliverance. Historians still argue whether that connection matters today. Is it reasonable to tie the Islamic Republic to the Zoroastrian dynasties of 2,500 years ago? Politically, no. The ideologies are worlds apart, but culturally, emotionally, even mythically, there's something there. The land remembers, even if the governments forget. Mountains don't change borders. Rivers still run where they always have. And the stones of Susa, Ecbatana, Persepolis, they're still here, watching, listening. You pass a weathered school in rural Iran. The children recite modern poems, but the walls are built from clay pressed by hands not so different from those that welcomed Esther to the palace or carried letters sealed with the king's ring somewhere nearby. A scholar types up a dissertation on the Aramaic loanwords in early Persian administration. She doesn't call it biblical, but it is. In a library in Tehran, a professor flips through a Hebrew manuscript held together by thread and time. He's not religious, but he's tracing the way Jewish thought survived inside Persian soil. Another academic nearby cross-references Persian cosmology with post-exilic Jewish apocalyptic thought. The overlap? It's subtle, but it's there. Ideas migrated alongside people, a quiet exchange of metaphors, fears, and hopes. Two traditions shaping each other in ways no emperor ever planned. One quirky legend, passed down by Jewish communities in Iran, claims that somewhere in the mountains, a small village still keeps the Sabbath without knowing why. The people speak an odd dialect, cook lamb in a particular way, and bury their dead facing west. No Torah scrolls remain, no rabbis visit, but the pattern lingers, faint echoes of a law once carried east by men who had no home to return to. No one can verify the story, but somehow it feels true. Or maybe we just need it to be. And that brings us to the present, the Iran of news alerts, protests, and nuclear negotiations. It's easy to lose the thread here. The transition from biblical empire to modern nation-state is not seamless, but the echoes persist. Whether you're standing in Jerusalem reading Isaiah's praise of Cyrus, or standing on a rooftop in Shiraz, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, the same unspoken question hovers in the air. What part does this land still play in the divine drama? Perhaps none. Perhaps every part. Maybe modern Iran is just a country, complicated, proud, repressive, resilient. Maybe the connections are historical accidents, stretched too far by preachers and dreamers. But then again, maybe not. Maybe there really is a thread that began with Daniel's visions, was reinforced by Cyrus's decree, shimmered in Esther's courage, and now wins invisibly through dusty towns and whispered prayers. You breathe deeply, catching the scent of spice in the air, cardamom, cinnamon, and smoke. Somewhere, a muezzin calls out. Somewhere else, an old woman lights a candle beside a photo of her grandson. You walk on, past shopkeepers and school children, past scholars and soldiers, until the road narrows and the noise fades. And in that stillness, you remember, prophecy isn't just about prediction, it's about presence. It's about seeing eternity folded into ordinary places. And Iran is one of those places, a land that once sent its armies to crush nations, and later freed a people to rebuild theirs. A land where Jewish sages once debated the Torah under Persian roofs. A land that became both villain and hero in the same sacred story. And maybe that's why the Bible never really let go of Iran. Not because it was perfect, but because it was part of the story, and still is. As you close your eyes, you see a scroll unrolling again. The ink is old, but not faded. The words are ancient, but they breathe. And there, tucked between the lines of judgment and mercy, of exile and return, is the outline of a land shaped like a lion, holding its place in the margins of Scripture, not front and center, but never fully erased. As we reach the end of tonight's long and winding story, the pace begins to slow. The torchlight of empires flickers out, and the scrolls, once held tightly in trembling hands, are carefully rolled up and placed back on their shelves. The dust of ancient roads settles. The voices of kings and prophets grow quiet, like distant echoes fading into sleep. What remains is stillness. You're lying there, somewhere between dream and memory, with images drifting through your mind. A golden decree from Cyrus, the hush of Esther's chamber, the silent bravery of Daniel in a foreign court. You've traveled far tonight, across centuries and deserts, across palaces and prayer rooms, through prophecy and politics. But now, the journey softens. The hard outlines of history blur into calm. Maybe you picture a scroll gently closing in the dark, or a starlit sky over a quiet village in the Iranian highlands. Maybe you hear the hush of wind moving through broken columns, or the creak of an ancient gate that no longer leads anywhere. It doesn't matter. The story is safe now, and so are you. You've wandered through the forgotten corners of the Bible and the Persian world, discovering just how much still lingers in the soil of old places. But for now, the time for wandering is over. Your breathing slows, your mind quiets. The names, the dates, the scrolls, they can wait. Let them rest. You're here. The lights are low. The hum of the fan is steady. And this story, it will be right here, waiting for you again whenever your eyes grow heavy and you need something old and gentle to carry you into sleep. End of story. Sweet dreams.